welcome to part 2 of the week 8 reading lectures for Ethics of Nature. So we established in the first part of this lecture that envy, jealousy, these things are like a regulatory mechanism for our tendency or our adaptation to social egalitarianism. We also established that mimicry is an amazing human capability, maybe our greatest one, but that it can also be maladaptive in certain circumstances. Similarly, envy functions this way too. So now we live in a much more socially hierarchical culture. So the question is, because we do, is it true? And here I have a picture in your PowerPoint of a monkey's butt, right? And it has to do with this old saying that the higher up the monkey climbs, the more you can see its butt. And the meaning of this expression is that the more someone becomes this kind of like powerful figure, the more obvious their flaws become. And that's true in part because we like to make fun of our leaders, right? So gossip, mockery, these sort of social mechanisms that are associated with things like envy functioned in the past to give our leaders a reality check, right? When they got too big for their boots, we would make fun of them as a way of kind of bringing them down a peg, right? Now that's an evolutionary adaptation. So it's funny, like the next time you're hanging out with your friends and one of them is like, just won't stop talking about themselves, and you guys are like, eye roll. Oh my God, I can't believe it. So selfish, right? Know that that's an evolutionary adaptation. So the question is, does our current state where we have like fantastically wealthy celebrities, does it mean that we're kind of in trouble as a culture? Well, I'll let you contemplate that. But just know that our sort of moral natures are clashing with the current conditions of our social organization, particularly in which wealth accounts for so much individual power. So that's important to understand that. So yeah, humans like to question authority. And greed, the acquisitive urge, the desire to like take more, to have more, this is another kind of adaptation that has more to do with our environments, right? So one of the most interesting and sort of most commonly discussed maladaptive behavioral tendencies in humans is the desire to pig out on ice cream and snack food and chips and anything that's high in fat and in sugars. And this is like an ancient adaptation that goes back, way before we evolved into Homo sapiens. That's a part of our brain that's related to like our kind of like very earliest ancestors, in which those of us who would gorge on sugars and fats survived better than those who were like, oh, I'll take a salad, because resources were so scarce that having a kind of impulse towards greed actually was a successful survival strategy for humans. So now here we live in a culture in which, for many of us, although there is a large number of people who don't have enough access to nutrition, but for many humans, especially when it comes to foods that are bad for you, processed foods that are high in chemically manufactured sugars and fats, we live surrounded by junk food. Go to the gas station and look at the shelves, and what do you see? Look at the coolers, and ask yourself what you are looking at beyond the brands of the neatly stacked cans. You're looking at, from your brain standpoint, a dead animal, a beehive full of sugars, right? Or a tree full of rotting fruit that you have to eat all right now, or else the nutrition will be lost, right? In the era before refrigeration and preservation. So now we have a situation in which many more humans, die from overeating than do from hunger or famine, right? So, and that's because of a maladaptive evolutionary mechanism. So money, which, as you know, is an extremely recent invention. Wealth was measured in different ways in our more ancient periods, but money is like a number in a bank account representing cash. All this is extremely recent. So our brains still associate money with other things, right? Because we don't have a part of our brain hasn't evolved yet to recognize money. So, for example, the same area is fire, as like when you feel intense sexual desire, lust, as when you're thinking about acquiring money. So for our brains, those two things are kind of confused, which is why people can get very greedy, and you see those fake Instagram posts with people posing with like fans of bills next to a Maserati, or a Bentley, because they're basically saying, "Aren't I sexy? Please come and mate with me." So that's important to recognize. Now, DeWall goes on in this chapter to talk about the importance of trust building and in terms of social bonds, right? And he gives a very cool but kind of disturbing example of how capuchin monkeys in Madagascar perform these acts that are pretty clearly about building social bonds within the group. So one will stick his finger up the other one's nose to the second knuckle, right there. And if the other one moves, it could go right into his brain. So they have to totally stay still. And it's like, the one is like, "I won't hurt you." And the other one's like, "Don't hurt me." And they kind of go into this like trance. And they do it too with their fingers in each other's eyes. They go underneath the eyelid. Ugh, it's so hard. But the function of these trust building exercises should be familiar to us if you've ever seen people making out at a party where you're like, "Get a room," or whatever. The point is that these types of physical acts, while they can be and are also related to sex, they really serve as a kind of social trust exercise. The same as on those corporate retreats when we fall into each other's arms backwards. So the point is that this is further evidence for how we kind of evolved a tribal brain. And the importance of these kinds of trust building exercises among close-knit members of our tribe, right? So we talked before about how sometimes we can be deliberately sort of rude to our best friends, right? Where you're like, whatever, bitch. But you say that to your best friend because it's a way of signaling through a kind of a trust building exercise that I can say these things to you and you'll recognize what they are as a form of intimacy. Whereas you would never say that to someone that you don't know that well, right? So it's a signal and a reaffirmation of how to build strong social bonds. So that's an important feature. So keep in mind that DeWall wants us to remember that human social behavior and the good things about human beings from a moral standpoint are on a spectrum with other animals and other organisms. So we really can identify moral behaviors that transcend specific human cultural background and see them more as larger moral codes that can help us connect and to moderate each other's behavior, regardless of what cultural, religious, or ethnic background you might come from, right? So if we see some of these good moral evolved behaviors on a spectrum with other animals, then it's no longer possible to just say, well, that's just white European dudes came up with this moral code that kind of benefited them, and it doesn't really apply to me. Well, no, not if animals also display some of these same moral tendencies towards things like social capital, right? Another concept that DeWall discusses, and this has to do with these kinds of positive feedback loops of trust that we're describing. So even in a circumstance where we don't know people that well, it's possible for human to construct cultures that is much larger networks of other humans in which social trust is reliably given. And the example that DeWall talks about is Denmark. Frickin' Denmark. It's always Denmark. But it's true that they just leave their kids in strollers around and they never worry that these children will be harmed or abducted or in any way subjected to anything unkind. And in fact, they're right to assume that because it doesn't happen. And so they've just kind of established this cultural norm that extends much more widely than any tribal network. So the point is that it's possible to have country or cities or cultures in which people can feel very safe and they can trust each other even when they don't know each other, so that humans have this moral capacity to do this. But it's delicate, obviously, and the first time a child is abducted or harmed, kind of ruins it for everyone. But to focus on the positive here, it's important to recognize that these networks can be built. We can show evidence that they are, and so we can aspire to something kind of nice. Also, the exchanges that we get into for favors with one another, sometimes we see these as like, I guess, bad because they're kind of transactional, right? And we think of it as being kind of cold or, benefiting one person more than another. But they also can be a foundation for safe and positive, the building up of a higher standard of living. So that's it for today. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed it and learned something. And stay tuned for next week. Take care.